is now my honor to introduce our keynote speaker for today. Jono Anzalone is Vice President of International Services at the American Red Cross, based out of our headquarters in Washington, D.C. Having joined the Red Cross as a volunteer in 1994, he volunteered for local disaster responses and teaching CPR, first aid, and lifeguarding. Jono quickly fell in love with the mission of alleviating human suffering, and he was hooked for life. Jono also served as the interim regional executive for the Dakotas region for a short term in 2016. As Jono refers to his 86 days in the Dakotas, our team was fortunate to follow his lead. As Vice President of International Services, Jono oversees disaster preparedness, response, and recovery programming in more than 34 countries, including the Measles and Rubella Initiative, which since 2001 has helped vaccinate more than 2 billion children and reduce global measles by 84%. Greater than 20.4 million lives. Please join me in welcoming Jono Anzalone.
Sorry. Hugs are mandatory, in and out of the Dakotas. So good afternoon. Good to see some familiar faces and really to be back in the Dakotas. I could not be more excited to be here. When Lynn reached out like 6 months ago and said, "Are you available?" I did everything in my human powers to bookend anything that might get in the way of me coming back to the Dakotas. As I'll talk about a little bit, I grew up in the Red Cross in Omaha, Nebraska, and those 86 days were some of the best days, period, that I've served my Red Cross career. Some of the visuals that you'll see on the screen really are just a journey on really starting as a 14-year-old within the Red Cross in Omaha, Nebraska. And I walked into a chapter, I did some CPR first aid training in order to become a lifeguard, and I remember thinking, this is kind of a neat place. We talk about these values of humanity and impartiality and neutrality and the ways that we serve, working side by side with fire department and emergency managers across the United States. And I was really taken aback by not only the mission in my own backyard in Omaha, Nebraska, but also the global mission and how so many of those 7 fundamental values were guiding the last 135 years that we've been fortunate to operate in the Americas with the American Red Cross. I could not be happier to be here today to talk about how I think what we do in our backyards here in the Dakotas really does transcend any state or county geography, but really is part of this global mission to alleviate human suffering. So on the next slide, just a little bit in terms of who we are. This is nothing new to our volunteers, our donors, our paid staff, folks that are in the room. But within the American Red Cross, we've been very privileged since Clara Barton, our founder, really saw this mission right around the Civil War time to alleviate human suffering. And really who we are today and still collecting 40% of the nation's blood supply, or like the chief mentioned, which is installing free smoke alarms. Seems like a very minor thing, but we still have more than 2,500 deaths every single year in the United States, which is astonishing because that's more than putting tornadoes and hurricanes and floods together every single year, and yet still people lose their lives over that simple $15 smoke alarm. You know what we do in disasters, whether it's a Red River flood or other minor or major disasters, the Red Cross is there, as well as our mission on preparing those with life-saving skills like CPR, first aid, and life-saving lessons. So I'll spend a little bit of time talking about the unit that I have the privilege of leading, which is our International Services Unit. And on the next slide, really starting with our mission. I typically don't spend a lot of time on the mission, but I think it's important for us just to reflect. Whether we're donors or volunteers or paid staff or volunteer staff, is this concept of reduction of human suffering, because it guides us in 190 countries across the globe. I'll say that again, 190 other countries that have a Red Cross or Red Crescent have a very similar mission, which is the alleviation of human suffering. Regardless of what your gender is, regardless of what your age is or your socioeconomic status, It's really the key driver for everything that we do, from Bismarck to Bangladesh to Boston to Boise. It really is the underpinning of our entire mission. On the next slide, I'll talk a little bit about why we do the work that we do across the globe. So the next slide is just some really breaking trends, and I'll have you advance 4 slides to put them all up there, the 4 quadrants. Regardless of the cause, and that's something you don't hear the American Red Cross talking a lot about. We're not casting blame on what's causing human suffering. We're not there talking about controversial things that may involve climate science or belief that there's a certain driver of conflict. We simply know that people are suffering. And dating back to the origins of when our founder of the American Red Cross, Clara Barton, really envisioned this kind of global network, not just in America, but this global network, it was all about the root cause of human suffering. And you can see these trends up on the screen. 175 million people that are displaced by either natural disasters or conflict. Or as we see every single day in the news, we wake up, roughly 60 million plus people that are impacted by some sort of conflict, whether it's places like Syria or in Myanmar and Bangladesh, where we're seeing one of the largest population movements in history. So these numbers really do cause everybody in this room that raised their hand or stood up as a volunteer, the paid staff, and I want to believe our donors, to keep coming back, to have hope that we can reverse some of these trends. And as Lynn mentioned, this lower right-hand statistic where we know that there are still 16,000 children a day that die from preventable diseases. 16,000 children a day that die. And it really is mind-boggling when we try to put our arms around all of these statistics. The next slide is just a capture in terms of what we see and what you heard about from the heroes that were recognized, as well as from both our prior and current board chair, which is this idea that every couple of seconds we're responding to something, whether it's the 60,000+ single-family home fires across the United States, or still collecting 40% of the nation's blood supply across the United States. These are drivers of what connect this idea of alleviation of human suffering from where we're sitting today all the way across the globe. And I love that herb statistic, which talked about people like the Hankies who will get in an herb and drive regardless of where we point them and add miles to those emergency response vehicles, because I want to believe we see the commonality of people that we're going to serve. The next visual really talks about some of our global positions at the American Red Cross. So I mentioned we're one of 190 others. We have a very rich history here in the United States after the Civil War, with Clara Barton envisioning this thing that would help people regardless of whether they were fighting with the North or the South, regardless of whether or not they were on the wrong side. Recognize that when people aren't partaking in conflict and they're unarmed, that they have a right to have their human dignity preserved. And that really drives our global programs. This is just a little snapshot from a couple weeks ago of all the places where we have American Red Cross delegations or operations, thanks to the generosity of our donors. What you don't see here are things like the Guatemala volcano, which is impacting 1.3 million people. Every day, it looks like a Christmas tree. It just lights up with new and complex humanitarian disasters across the globe. The next visual really kind of paints the picture on how we operate. So you heard a little bit about what we do in the Dakotas. I learned a ton during my 86-day detail here. I'll talk a little bit about how it contrasts globally. So the next visual talks about really this global network, the 190 other Red Cross or Red Crescent national societies that serve as auxiliaries to government, but yet we're independent, we're neutral, we're impartial. So it allows us to deliver those services in a way that makes sure that we're following those fundamental principles and recognizing the human dignity of all people. And what always amazes me when we look at this global statistic, 1 in 25 people that have been touched by a Red Cross service across the globe. Not just in the United States, but across the globe. And it's hard to not go somewhere with a Red Cross emblem where somebody doesn't have a Red Cross story, where we're still reconnecting family members that lost connections with loved ones during the Holocaust, or during the first Iraq occupation in the early 90s. There's always somebody that has a Red Cross story that was assisted by being able to walk into an office like here in North Fargo and being able to connect to those life-saving missions that are out there. On the next slide, one of my passions is to really talk about the difference. I'm a firm believer there's no such thing as a better non-governmental organization or a worse. We just have different missions, we have different drivers, we have different ethos and beginnings. And a large part of what differentiates us, if we click one more time, are two really important things. This idea of neutrality, so the Red Cross doesn't get on the news and denounce government actions or political parties, or we don't say that climate change is real or not real, because ultimately we want to maintain that position of focusing on the communities that we serve, focusing on where it matters most, like when we arrive at a home fire, and really caring for the victims of disasters, whether they be man-made or conflict. And then also this idea of local trust and knowledge. So dissimilar to what we see in Fargo, where there's amazing volunteers in the audience that'll drive from here to Rapid City if there's a big wildfire and support, we rarely deploy Americans overseas. And the reason is, in this picture in the lower right-hand corner, is a volunteer helping with our measles and rubella initiative in Tanzania. It's a guy by the name of Antoine. And Antoine obviously is from the community. He knows the language, the villagers trust him. And what Antoine's doing here, he's actually going village to village on a bicycle because there's not paved roads. And he's collecting village children. So the parents know him, because if somebody like me shows up and says, "Can I have your children for 4 or 5 hours?" might be a little suspicious, right? So the local trust and knowledge is what I see very similar to what we do in the United States. It's neighbors helping neighbors. And mobilization from where the trust and the network of human connection is, of course, really at the grassroots of our entire global network within 191 countries. The next visual really talks about what I also see as the reciprocal side. So for the first time since Hurricane Katrina, Rita, and Wilma in 2005, we actually raised our hands in the United States and cried uncle, because it was a really bad year, as you heard Lynn say, unprecedented in terms of the consecutive disasters that we saw back to back. And we knew that while we had an amazing mobilization of volunteers and donor support, there was a point in which we were fatigued. Enough was enough, if you will, especially after we put everything that we had in terms of effort and energy into Texas. Meanwhile, wildfires out in the west, and then we saw Irma, and then Maria, just kept getting worse. We actually raised our hand to our international partners and said, "Can you help us?" with very specialized skill sets. So one of my favorite examples is the Danish Red Cross, are known for setting up operational base camps. And so in the Florida Keys, where there was a lot of suffering and a lot of hurt, they actually deployed one of their completely self-contained base camps to house our volunteers and our responders in the Florida Keys. And it took 24 hours. No kidding. I called Copenhagen. I said, "We need some help." They said, "When do you need it?" They flew to Miami within 24 hours, and then we mobilized that network. And that's just one example of the power, the connectivity. And we don't have to wonder if they're going to show up and they're not going to like a certain type of people, because we all subscribe to the same 7 fundamental principles. And you can be halfway across the globe and see the principle of humanity and the principle of neutrality. And we go into the Red Cross office here in Fargo and we see those 7 fundamental principles. And it's one of the drivers that's kept me coming back since 1994, is recognizing that's something special, that's something unique, transcending any politics between governments, that really is something that we have to cherish. The next visual is really a little bit about what we do. I'll cover these fairly quickly, and I'm more than happy afterwards or offline to send you some additional information. But the next visual really just talks about what we do. So you heard Lynn talking about our measles and rubella initiative, which I'll refer to. But very similar to what we do in the US, we do preparedness across the globe, and I'll talk about that. We do response and recovery in complex disasters, and then we help to save lives with that 20 million children that are saved as a result of our focus on the eradication of measles. So the next visual really just kind of breaks it down. So this is what preparedness looks like in a place, in a context, in a continent like Africa. Very basic interventions, teaching community members how to mobilize if there's a hazard. So we give them training on bullhorns or on early warning systems, and also working with their governments, because it's a key enabler to systematizing the life-saving activity that we do across the globe. One of my favorite visuals on the next slide is where we have specialized in these early warning systems, where in most cases people will ask me, "Well, isn't that the job of government?" And generally speaking, in the US, I can proudly say yes, that is. We have amazing government partners here in the US. But in very poor, fragile contexts, that's not always the case. So the next visual really shows a real-life example of this. And you can click about 6 or 7 through the end of the 2010-2011 period, where this terrible cyclone just decimated Bangladesh. It's a country in Asia that has 2 cyclone seasons. They're very unfortunate that they have 2, unlike our one, which typically starts June 1st here in the US and ends through the peak of November 1st. But you can see the loss of lives. Nearly 500,000 people killed in 1970 because of cyclone season in Bangladesh. And Cyclone Bola wasn't an anomaly. This happened every single year in Bangladesh. And as a result, the American Red Cross said, we know how to solve this. It's a matter of teaching communities how to build early warning systems, how to notify each other using meteorological data. It did exist in 1970, and really to build in a culture of preparedness along the coastal lines of Bangladesh, which is one of the most densely populated communities in the world. And as you can see, good news story, the last clip will show you that or the last bullet, pardon me, will show you that we are down to less than 50 people as casualties every single year. Still too high, but it's because of the early warning systems working with the Bangladeshi government that have allowed us to save vulnerable communities that often don't know that they're in vulnerable places. So just one example. The next slide is a little short video that we'll pull up that talks a little bit about how we're still reconnecting families. I mentioned that we're still doing retracing from the Holocaust, and I'll have my colleagues in back pull up the video that tells a little bit more about what we're doing to reconnect families across the globe.
Is this your friend? Okay.
He's 33 years old. He's got blonde hair. He's only that big.
So very few people realize that even in the United States after a disaster, the American Red Cross is reconnecting family members through our family unification system. And as the video talked about, for any parent that's ever lost a child, I used to play in the little clothing racks of Yonkers growing up as a kid, and it used to terrify my mother because she'd lose me. And that feeling of not knowing where your child is. And every single day, 3 people are reunited. In fact, my very first day on my 86 days in Fargo, I took an Uber, which is like a taxi, from the Fargo airport, and I got in the car, and the guy started talking to me, what are you doing in Fargo? And I said, I worked for Red Cross. He goes, I know exactly where the office is. And I said, oh, really, why? And in 1994, he came from Iraq, was a refugee, and lost connection with his family. And he knew that he could go to the Red Cross in order to reestablish that link. Working with the American Red Cross, us contacting the Iraqi Red Crescent National Society to physically reconnect him with his brothers. And this is something that he'll never forget. And people often forget that it sometimes isn't about handing out a meal or handing out financial assistance. It's about reconnecting psychological connections that are often disrupted after a disaster. So on the next visual, a little bit about what we do with measles. Lynn showcased this. We're up to 20 million plus children's lives that are saved, 2 billion children that have been vaccinated. And we're a very unlikely partner at the American Red Cross. Like, why work with the Red Cross? Because you have all the medical professionals, the World Health Organization, etc. And the reason that they come to us time and time again since we've been doing this program in 2001 when it started is because we have access to communities across the globe where no one else has access. So in very difficult places like Syria, they recognize that if we're wearing a Red Cross or a Red Crescent, we're not there for anything more than to deliver humanitarian assistance. And that can be a very difficult dialogue when you're trying to negotiate access into communities that are torn by war and different political factions. The next visual talks about what I feel is the underpinning of everything that we do. Everything that we do, from Fargo to Sioux Falls to Nebraska, keep going down south, all the way to Buenos Aires. It is about this concept that everybody has a right to human dignity. And it's been recognized, right? It's not just Jono up on a stage talking about this concept of human dignity. I think it's what donors think about when they write a check to the organization of choice. It's what volunteers get up every single day at 2 o'clock in the morning or 3 o'clock in the morning to respond to a single family fire, or going door to door in low-income neighborhoods to install smoke alarms. It is about that general concept, that humanitarian value that we are all humans and have a right to humanitarian obligations towards each other. Next visual is just kind of my wrapping up comments. So tying it back to where I started, 1994, there are many choices in life. I graduated, my parents, I think, thought I was crazy, went to graduate school with a master's in economics, and they're like, you're going to work for the Red Cross, that place where you volunteer. I'm like, you don't understand. You don't understand the mission, which is much larger than myself, much larger than any one of us in the room. And that was solidified in my mind shortly after I went on my first national disaster deployment in Hamburg, Iowa. 1997, 1998, the Nishnabata River had flooded. And I was driving an emergency response vehicle with a 75-year-old volunteer from Springfield, Missouri. Her name is Lorraine, and has since passed on. And I said to Lorraine, like, why? Why do you volunteer? You're 75, I'm 18. Why do you do this work? You have so many other joys in your life. You have grandchildren, an amazing husband. She says, I'm not going to answer that question until we out-process tomorrow, which is the day that we, basically turn the keys and go back home. And that next day she came and she handed me this little sheet of paper, which I still today carry around every single move I made with the American Red Cross. And the verse is indicative of a quote that her 7th grade home economics teacher gave to her in Springfield, Missouri. And the quote is, you've got to give yourself to life before you really live. It's foolish hoarding love or wealth, those lose who never give. And she said to me that those words, as a young female growing up in Springfield, Missouri, drove her to a lifelong commitment to try to find ways to make people's lives better during their worst day. And I really do think it's indicative of what we're doing here in the Dakotas, and I think it's indicative of what this global network is doing. And last but not least, I just want to say thank you to the entire Dakotas team. I could not have been more excited 6 months ago when Lynn reached out, because this is just a special place for me in being able to come home and see volunteers and friends and donors and the amazing partners that are represented in this room. So without further ado, thank you so much, and I'll turn it back over to Lynn.